Walter Francis White was a black American who looked white, yet lived his life with an unshakable conviction. He knew exactly who he was. Born in Atlanta in 1893, with blonde hair and blue eyes, White could move through a society rigidly divided by race in a way few black Americans ever could. But he did not see his appearance as an escape. Instead, it became the starting point of a far more dangerous and meaningful journey. From an early age, White was raised within Atlanta's African American community, surrounded by black churches, black schools, and black professionals who instilled in him discipline, education, and a deep sense of responsibility. At home, his parents enforced strict routines, intellectual rigor, and moral clarity. Outside, the city reminded him daily that identity in America was not defined by character but by power. Segregation was not an abstract concept to Walter White, it was lived reality, enforced by law, custom, and fear. As a child, he learned quickly that society saw him as an anomaly, too white to be accepted by some, yet unmistakably black under the rules of Jim Crow. That tension would shape his worldview. While others might have chosen silence or concealment, White chose awareness. He understood that race in America was not about biology, but about control, and that truth would later guide his life's work. This is not simply a story about passing as white. It is the story of a man who refused to pass on justice, a man who stood at the crossroads of two worlds and chose to confront one of the darkest chapters in American history, armed with intellect, courage, and an unyielding sense of identity. If stories that uncover hidden histories and challenge what we think we know matter to you, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us. This story is only just beginning. As a child, Walter White did not learn about racial violence from history books or distant stories passed down by adults. He encountered it directly, in the streets of his own city, at an age when most children are still discovering the boundaries of their neighborhood. Atlanta in the early 20th century was often praised as a symbol of progress in the South, a place where black education and enterprise seemed to offer hope. Yet beneath that surface, fear and resentment simmered, waiting for a spark. In September 1906, that spark ignited, and the illusion of safety vanished almost overnight. Rumors spread through the white press and along street corners, unverified accusations that black men had threatened white women. The city's atmosphere thickened with tension, and by nightfall, mobs began to form. Walter was only 13, old enough to sense danger but too young to fully grasp how quickly order could collapse. What he saw during those days would remain with him for the rest of his life. Streets he knew became scenes of chaos, where shouting crowds moved with a sense of purpose that left no room for mercy or restraint. Black citizens, many of them ordinary workers, were hunted simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. From his own home, White witnessed how fragile the protections of law truly were. Police presence offered no reassurance, and official authority seemed either unwilling or unable to intervene. Families who had lived peacefully in their neighborhoods suddenly prepared for the possibility that violence could reach their door. For Walter and his father, survival depended on vigilance, restraint, and the terrifying awareness that one misstep could change everything. Though his skin was light, he understood that the forces outside did not recognize nuance or fairness. Identity, once assigned, could not be negotiated. That night, as fear settled into the silence between distant shouts, something fundamental shifted inside him. The danger was not abstract, and hatred was not random. It was organized, justified, and tolerated. So Walter realized that what separated safety from destruction was not innocence or guilt, but power. He also understood that the same society capable of turning violently against its own citizens could do so again, unless challenged. This experience did more than frighten him. It clarified his sense of purpose. He emerged from that moment with a deeper awareness of his own identity and an unshakable resolve not to become hardened by bitterness. He would later write that he felt repelled by the hatred he witnessed, yet grateful that he did not share it. That distinction mattered to him. It marked the beginning of a lifelong commitment to confront injustice without surrendering his humanity. The Atlanta race massacre did not make Walter White a victim. It made him a witness, and eventually, a force. Long before he carried titles or influence, before he walked into hostile towns under assumed identities, the foundation of his moral convictions had already been laid. The child who survived those nights grew into a man who understood that silence could be as dangerous as violence, and that confronting injustice required both courage and clarity. Although Walter White possessed the rare ability to pass as white, he never treated it as a doorway out of the world that had shaped him. The experiences of his childhood, especially the terror and clarity forged during the Atlanta race violence, had already taught him that safety gained through denial came at too high a cost. For White, appearance was not an identity, and concealment was not freedom. Instead, he came to see his unusual position as a responsibility, one that placed him in the narrow space between danger and opportunity. As he grew older, White understood something many never fully grasped. Racism did not depend on how a person looked, but on who held power and who was permitted to belong. His pale skin could shield him temporarily, but it could not erase the reality that laws, customs, and social codes were designed to control black lives. Rather than fleeing from that truth, he leaned into it. He chose to remain openly connected to the black community that had raised him, even while learning how easily the world mistook him for someone else. When White began his work as an investigator and advocate, this duality became central to his mission. In hostile environments where black activists would have been instantly rejected or endangered, he could move with relative ease. He could enter train stations, courthouses, shops, and private conversations without raising suspicion. People spoke freely around him, often revealing the very attitudes and actions they would have concealed in the presence of someone they recognized as black. White listened carefully, storing details that would later form the backbone of reports, exposés, and campaigns for justice. Yet this strategy was never without risk. Passing was not a mask that could be worn comfortably. Every conversation required precision, every gesture restraint. A misplaced word, a familiar expression, or a moment of empathy could unravel the illusion and place his life in immediate danger. White lived with the constant awareness that his safety depended on remaining convincing, even as his conscience urged him to remember who he was and why he was there. The tension between appearance and truth followed him everywhere, sharpening his focus and deepening his resolve. What made White's approach remarkable was not the deception itself, but its purpose. He did not use his access to accumulate personal comfort or social privilege. Instead, he used it to document violence, expose injustice, and force uncomfortable realities into public view. By gathering first-hand accounts and confronting communities with evidence they could not easily dismiss, he challenged the silence that allowed injustice to persist. His work showed that the systems protecting racial violence were sustained not only by fear, but by secrecy. Over time, this strategy transformed White into one of the most effective voices against racial injustice in America. He navigated spaces that were closed to others, not because he wished to belong there, but because truth needed a way in. His ability to pass became a tool, sharpened by experience and guided by principle, used in service of a cause far larger than himself. In choosing this path, Walter White redefined what it meant to resist racism. He demonstrated that identity could be a source of strength even when it was invisible, And that courage sometimes meant walking directly into the heart of danger, armed not with force, but with clarity, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to justice. When Walter White joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1918, he did not arrive as a figurehead or a distant strategist. He came shaped by lived experience, by memories of fear, and by a clear understanding of how easily violence could be hidden behind silence and indifference. America at the time was gripped by racial tension, and acts of mob violence were still treated by many as an unfortunate but accepted part of public life. White recognized that changing this reality would require more than moral appeals. It would demand evidence, persistence, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. From the beginning, his work with the organization took him into the most dangerous corners of the country. He traveled to towns where violence had occurred, not as an outsider seeking attention, but as a careful observer determined to document what others wanted forgotten. His ability to move through white spaces without immediate suspicion allowed him to collect first-hand accounts, observe local reactions, and understand how communities justified acts of cruelty. These investigations formed the foundation of a national strategy, transforming isolated incidents into undeniable patterns that could no longer be dismissed. As White's influence grew, so did the scope of his ambition. He understood that exposing injustice was only the first step. The greater challenge was shifting public opinion in a nation accustomed to looking away. Through carefully written reports, public statements, segregation, and relentless advocacy, he reframed acts of racial violence not as regional issues, but as national failures that threatened the moral standing of the entire country. By doing so, he forced citizens, journalists, and lawmakers to confront realities they had long ignored. When White later became executive secretary of the NAACP, his role expanded from investigator to architect of a broader movement. He coordinated campaigns that linked grassroots activism with national pressure, ensuring that stories from small towns reached the desks of influential decision-makers. He urged political leaders to take public stands, understanding that words spoken from positions of power could influence both policy and perception. Even when legislation stalled, the conversations he helped ignite continued to reshape the public conscience. White's leadership was defined by consistency rather than spectacle. He believed that progress was built through sustained effort, not dramatic gestures. Under his guidance, the organization strengthened its legal strategies, expanded its networks, and cultivated a new generation of advocates who would carry the struggle forward. His work laid the groundwork for challenges to segregation in education, employment, and public life, demonstrating that the law could be a tool for transformation rather than merely a barrier. Perhaps most importantly, White helped change how Americans talked about racial violence. What had once been treated as isolated events became widely recognized as systemic injustice. By insisting on accountability and refusing to allow silence to prevail, he helped move the nation closer to acknowledging its own contradictions. His leadership did not end in justice, but it altered the direction of the conversation, making denial increasingly difficult. In guiding national campaigns against lynching and segregation, Walter White turned personal resolve into collective action. He transformed memory into momentum, and fear into purpose, leaving a lasting imprint on the struggle for justice that would continue long after his tenure ended. As Walter White's influence within the NAACP expanded, his vision for change moved beyond exposing injustice toward building a structure capable of dismantling it. He understood that lasting progress could not rely solely on public outrage or investigative reports. The system that sustained segregation and inequality was built on laws, court decisions, and political compromise, and it would ultimately have to be challenged on those same terms. With this clarity, White turned his attention to the courtroom and the corridors of power, where quieter battles often carried the greatest consequences. One of his most consequential decisions was recognizing the potential of young legal minds who could translate moral urgency into legal precision. Among them was Thurgood Marshall, a determined and disciplined attorney whose talents White quickly identified as essential to the future of civil rights litigation. Rather than limiting Marshall's role, White encouraged him to take on complex and risky cases, offering institutional backing and strategic guidance. This trust was not casual. It reflected White's belief that leadership meant creating space for others to rise. Through this mentorship, legal challenges that once seemed impossible began to take form, steadily chipping away at the legal foundations of segregation. Under White's leadership, the NAACP increasingly turned to the courts as arenas of transformation. Lawsuits were not merely responses to injustice. They were calculated steps in a long campaign. Each case was selected with an eye toward precedent, each argument crafted to expose the contradictions between American ideals and American practice. These efforts laid the groundwork for challenges that would eventually reshape public education, government institutions, and the broader understanding of equal protection under the law. Though victories were often slow and contested, the strategy itself marked a turning point in how civil rights activism operated. At the same time, White recognized that legal success required political will. He worked tirelessly to bring civil rights issues into the national political conversation, engaging directly with presidents and lawmakers. His approach was firm but strategic, combining moral appeal with public pressure. He urged leaders to speak out, knowing that silence from those in power reinforced injustice as effectively as hostile rhetoric, even when immediate results were elusive. These efforts helped redefine civil rights as a national responsibility rather than a regional concern. White's presence in Washington was not driven by personal ambition. He saw political engagement as a necessary extension of advocacy, a way to ensure that legal gains were supported rather than undermined. By pressing Congress and the executive branch to confront segregation and discrimination, he helped normalize the idea that federal authority had a role in protecting civil rights. This shift in perspective would later prove essential as broader reforms gained momentum. What set White apart was his ability to connect these different arenas into a coherent strategy. Mentorship, litigation, and political advocacy were not separate pursuits, but interconnected paths toward the same goal. He believed that empowering capable individuals, strengthening institutions, and challenging power directly were all essential to meaningful change. Through these efforts, Walter White helped shape a generation of leaders and a framework for reform that extended far beyond his own lifetime. The victories that followed were built on foundations he helped lay, foundations rooted in patience, strategy, and an unwavering belief that justice could be pursued through both law and leadership. Beyond activism, Walter White understood that laws alone could not reshape a nation's conscience. Stories, culture, and imagination also carried power, and he used them with the same discipline and intent that defined his public work. During the Harlem Renaissance, a period when Black writers, artists, and thinkers were redefining how African American life was seen and understood, White emerged as both a participant and a quiet architect. He wrote not to entertain, but to reveal, believing that literature could reach hearts where speeches and court rulings could not. Through novels, essays, and investigative writing, White explored the psychological and moral costs of racial injustice. His stories confronted readers with uncomfortable truths, forcing them to see how violence, fear, and denial shaped everyday life. Unlike many political texts of the era, his work spoke in human terms, drawing readers into the inner lives of characters navigating identity, belonging, and moral choice. These narratives extended the reach of his activism, allowing him to challenge injustice across boundaries of race and geography. White also used his influence to support other voices. He encouraged emerging writers and helped connect them with publishers and audiences who might otherwise have remained close to them. In doing so, he contributed to a cultural movement that reshaped American literature and expanded the space for Black expression. Harlem became not just a neighborhood, but a symbol of intellectual and artistic renewal, and White's presence within that world reflected his belief that cultural change and social change were inseparable. Yet his legacy remains complex. White lived between worlds, navigating spaces that few could enter and making choices that invited both admiration and criticism. Some questioned his methods, while others recognized the extraordinary risks he took in service of a larger goal. What cannot be disputed is the impact of his work. By the time of his death, public tolerance for racial violence had sharply declined, and the foundations of legal challenges to segregation were firmly in place. These shifts did not happen by accident. They were the result of sustained effort, strategic thinking, and moral courage. Walter White's life defies simple labels. He was an investigator, a strategist, a writer, and a mentor, but above all, he was a witness who refused to look away. His story reminds us that progress is often driven by individuals willing to stand in uncomfortable spaces and speak truths others would rather ignore. The changes he helped set in motion continued long after his voice fell silent, carried forward by those he inspired and empowered. Thank you for spending this time with us and engaging with this remarkable story. If you found value in exploring this chapter of history, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories that uncover the forces and individuals who shaped the world we live in today.